Hello and good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to our last installment of the biblical poetry class. I want to start by saying that this class is sponsored by Marianne Merrill, who I think is here with us. Are you here with us, Marianne? Marianne, who is sponsoring this class in honor of her mother, Judith Ratner, who she is observing Shloshim for today. Her mother passed away 30 days ago. Her name is Yehudit Bat Shmuel Vechana. And so we are dedicating our class to Yehudit's memory and to the elevation of her soul. Thank you, Marianne, for allowing us to learn in honor of your mother. I think Marianne will not mind if we include also our beloved Florine Rosen's brother Ray passed away, I think just a couple days ago. Was it 2 days ago, Florine? And Ray's name is Yossel Ben Label the Goldie Gali, and he had a hard time on his way out, and so we hope his soul feels some peace and also feels some elevation from our learning today. So may Torah uplift the souls of the departed. Let's say a blessing just to set that intention of elevation into our learning today. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Okay, I didn't see. Oh, there's Marianne Merrill. Marianne, thank you so much for sponsoring this learning. May your mother's memory be a blessing to you and to all of us. Okay, it's our last class, and we're going to return today to where we began, in one of our very first classes, which is to the song of the sea. And we're going to do that because we have to, because Passover is coming up on Saturday night, and this is the Passover poem. I mean, this is like you couldn't have a poetry class leading up to Passover that didn't make mention of the song of the sea, and yet we've seen it before, because we had to go there right away, because it isn't just the Passover song. In some ways, the Song of the Sea it's really the beginning of biblical poetry as a genre. We saw little scraps and snippets of poetic verse before this, but there's something that changes once we get the Song of the Sea. And I did this for the first few classes, but I'm going to do it one more time. Even the form of the Song of the Sea here is like a visual poem, and you can see that they're like, it's written in this sort of brickwork, they call it, because there they are passing through the sea, right? These are the Israelites in the middle here, and there's the sea splitting on either side. So it's really highlighted in the Torah, right? And we talked about the way that other poetic verses in the Torah aren't always so clearly marked, but this one is. And we looked at Moses's last poem last week, and indeed Moses can be thought of as, I mean, Moses is so much to us in this tradition, but one of the things that he is maybe I suggested last week, our kind of poet laureate, like the person who really founded the genre of biblical poetry, at least as our Torah imagines it beginning. And so tonight, I want to return to the Song of the Sea, but not to analyze it as we've done before, but instead to take some time, take us a little bit of a step back in this last conversation, and to think about how it is that if the Song of the Sea is the kind of the emergence of a new form, a new genre in our tradition, how it is that begins, how it is that emerges, poetry as a real distinct form of expression in ancient Israel, how it emerges, and why it emerges. And to do this, we're going to be asking theological questions, right? We're going to be, because this poetry is recited in response to some kind of divine interaction. We're going to be asking psychological questions. Like, what is it? What was Moses thinking? What were the children of Israel thinking, feeling, experiencing in this moment where suddenly they explode with poetic song? And we're going to be asking questions about the context, the Passover context, the Exodus context, which inevitably frames this poem as a poem of liberation, a poem of freedom, a poem that expresses the kind of the climax of the Passover struggle. Okay, so let's take a look. We're going to look briefly at the Song of the Sea itself, as we've done before. Here's a source sheet for you, and then very quickly going to start looking at several of our kind of great poetic and philosophical minds over the ages who have given us who have reflected deeply on the role of poetry in our tradition, and especially in this moment. So let's take a look. This is how it begins. This is how poetry, you might say, begins in ancient Israel. And it begins right here. It is chapter 15 of the book of Exodus, Parshat Bishalach, when Pharaoh sent the people out of Egypt. And as I just have suggested by showing you the form of the poem, it is taking place right in the midst of the greatest miracle in that story, the parting of the Red Sea. And in fact, the idea is that this is the poem that they sing immediately after they cross through the Red Sea. Okay, so this is like the last line of the chapter before which describes them crossing and moving through, and then finally, and some of it is severe and even gory. There, the Egyptian army is laying dead on the shore there. This is not an entirely happy moment, but it is a triumphant moment. And this is the last line, when the Vayar Yisrael et hayad hagdola asher asa Adonai b'Mitzrayim, vayiru ha'am et Adonai vayaminu b'Adonai u'b'Moshe avdo. And when the Eternal saw the mighty hand, and when Israel saw the mighty hand which the Eternal had wielded in Egypt, the people were in awe of the Eternal, and they had faith in the Eternal and in Moses, the servant of God. Okay, that's it. That's the end of the scene, except it's not. It's just the beginning, because now imagine it's like a musical. Now they break into a number, into song, and this is how it begins. Az yashir Moshe uvenei Yisrael et hashira hazot ladonai vayomru le'mor. And this is just the introduction, but it's an important introduction because it has this word that is our word for song, but it's also our word for poetry, right? So it is usually translated as, then Moses and the Israelites sang this song, but we could also translate it as Moses and the Israelites recited this poem to the Eternal. Okay, that's the word shira, and a big part of our work in the early stages of this class was to recognize that every time we say poem in ancient Hebrew, we're also saying song. And every time we say song, in a sense, we're also saying poetry. And part of that is because of the way that our poems are in fact chanted, right? Like we have this tradition, and that's what we do for all of the Torah. So it's Ashira Ladonai ki go goa sus v'rochvo ramavayam. I will sing to the Eternal, who has triumphed gloriously, who has hurled horse and driver into the sea. Ozi v'zimrat ya vayhili lishua ze eli v'anvehu Elohei avi v'aromamenu. The Eternal is my strength and might, and it has become my deliverance. This is my God, whom I will enshrine, the God of my Father, whom I will exalt. Okay, so that's it. That's the beginning. That's the moment in which biblical poetry emerges. But really the moment, and our kind of what we're going to use as our entry point today, is just that first word, the very first word, because it really highlights that it happened in a moment. And the first word is az yashir, right here. And az is a word which means then, okay? And it actually works the same way that it does in English, in that it can be then in the past or then in the future, okay? It is used in both of those ways. I think in modern Hebrew, it is now more commonly used as a future word, right? But it can go either way, as once or as future. Then it will be, then it was, okay? And actually, the truth is, now that I'm speaking in grammatical terms, I should also say that one of the interesting and kind of like curious thing about this opening is that it is the word for sang this song is in the future tense, as yashir. It should be in the past tense. Then Moses sang this song, but the commentators try to deal with why it seems to be that it says, and then Moses and the Israelites will sing this song. Okay, so that's just another curiosity to factor in. But there they go. They sing the song, they recite the poem, and they even the second part of this verse continues. Ashira, I will sing to the Eternal, or again, I will recite a poem to the Eternal. I think let's keep that in mind the whole time, that we're talking about singing and poetizing as what? I mean, that's our question. As a response to a moment, right? Something happened in that moment. And that's, I guess, what I want to start by asking you all. Then Moses sang, then the Israelites sang. So why? And why then? Why at that moment? Okay? And I want to ask that question. So I'm going to soon just see what your responses are. But I want to give you, two little sort of assists here in beginning to answer that question. And one of them is, of course, what we already looked at, which is that if you say then, well, then you ought to look at what just happened. Okay, so what just happened was the parting of the Red Sea, the defeat of the Egyptian army, and the awe and faith that they have in God and in Moses. So that's one thing to consider. Az is a direct kind of the moment after this moment. Okay. But let me give you also, someone is unmuted. Could you check your mute buttons? Raphael Penitz, I think that was you. The other thing that I want to give you, well, no, let's just stop there. Let's stop there. Tell me why at this moment would you say that Moses would erupt, maybe for the first time, into poetry? What is it about this moment that forces poetry, that brings about, that calls upon the poetic voice? Anyone want to take a first pass at that? I see Yael. Yael will help us.
I imagine that the appropriate response to God swooping down, putting his hand down, and opening the sea and letting Bnei Israel cross and survive their attackers, the appropriate response is this chanting of profound gratitude, because they could not have survived on their own. It had to be divine intervention. And so I'm so glad that you chanted it for us, because this chanting is the holy method of delivering sentiment. And
Okay.
I think that that's a very appropriate response to this divine intervention.
Okay, there's two words that you said that I want to underline. One is gratitude, which gives us one answer to the state of mind that produces the poetic voice is gratitude. That's one of the, right? That's clearly not the only one. We've looked at lots of different kinds of poems, but that an overwhelming feeling of gratitude would prompt poetry. And then, of course, the other word that you used, that it has less to do with the consciousness and more to do with the mechanism, the chant. And that is there is something about this moment that requires not a blessing or a speech, but a chant. Like, now there's some way in which the poetic form addresses that moment, that need to express gratitude. Okay, so let's keep building on that. Florine?
When you say the word chant, I'm a little confused. When was trope actually introduced? What, more or less, what century? And then if it were chant, who determined what the chant was? What did it come from?
Right. That's a good question that I bet someone on this Zoom knows how to answer better than I do. We speak of the Masoretic tradition that assigns the trope. And we also speak about the return from Babylon in the year, what is this? In the 400s before the Common Era, where there starts to be an official procedure for reading and chanting the Torah. Does anyone have a better answer, like a more specific answer to when the trope, the chant, is introduced? Anyone know this stuff well? Who wants to add?
Yeah, we know it was no later than when Ezra set up the system for Torah reading, right at the end of the Babylonian exile. We don't quite know when it starts. There was a big split already by that point between the Babylonian and the Tiberian systems of reading, but we know they did have notes at that point.
Okay, all right, good, that's helpful. And I think what part of what Yonatan's suggesting, and I think maybe the important point here is, it is clear that what the various chanting forms that we have now are an extension of the reality that this was a tradition of chanting. It was an orally the oral transmission of a tradition was the form in the ancient world. And so we have these systems for officially how we chant, but we have some notion that as far back as we can go, we imagined that this chanting was taking place. And in fact, that's what this story is imagining, is that Moses chanted, and then we'd spent some time in our first pass on this poem looking at how then Miriam and the women chanted the poem on sort of like as a seeming call and response or echo. So that's certainly like a part of the ancient means of communication, and not an exception to it. Okay, Ariel Ratner.
Thank you. A couple thoughts, one practical, one more theoretical. Practically speaking, it's one of the first times they have the opportunity to chant, right? They have a moment. They're not being pursued, they're not being harried, they're not slaves anymore. For the first time, they're really truly liberated, and across the Red Sea. So they're out of sort of traditional Egypt. So it's the first time they have the actual time to do it. And then very practically, and then I'm reminded just a couple things from other traditions, but Jesus speaks in parables. There's something about poetry that is holy, right? And it's the first time they've returned to, I mean, they're not fully in the land of Israel, but out of the land of Egypt. And there's something I think holier about chanting, singing, something like that. And then also from another tradition, I mean, you mentioned it a bit, but Homer chants, right? All these ancients chant because it's a way of preserving memory. And what an opportunity to sort of, I think both as a historical artifact, it probably reflects that, it's a sort of old part of the Torah, but also what an opportunity to sort of enshrine this moment.
Great, that's great. So you said a lot of things that are very helpful. The preserving aspect of poetry, the sanctifying aspect of poetry, but you also brought us to, for the first time, a real consideration of the way that poetry might be a response to liberation, in the sense that this is the moment where they have for the first time an ability to chant, to be the loudest voice in the room, to speak in a new voice, in an unbounded voice without fear, right? So this is an exclamation, a kind of proclamation of this new state of being, right? So that's good. That we're going to dig further into that. So I thank Ariel for beginning to put it into that context for us. All right, let's take one more comment and then we'll dive into some of the commentaries. Marlena?
I was just thinking of the pure joy it must have been to have escaped and to have come to some sort of safety. And because I'm a singer, I think to myself that one of my responses to joy is to sing and to express it that way, just to just shout out and sing. So that's my first response to this.
Okay, wonderful. That's wonderful. That's very helpful language, that you feel this joy and you have a response, Marlena says, a response. Right. And right. That language of response, almost automatic response, is exactly the language that the first sort of Jewish Hogeh thinker is going to be playing upon. And that is the first thinker we'll look at is the first thinker we almost always look at in the tradition of Jewish commentary, and that is Rashi. So take a look at what Rashi, a medieval French commentator, says about this moment of then it happened. And I think there's something in it that's similar to Marlena's response moment. Okay, so take a look. Rashi says, Az Yashir Moshe, then Moses sang, right then, when he saw the miracle, K'shara Hanes, Allah b'libo sheyashir shira. Then it arose in his heart that he had to sing a song or recite a poem. Okay, so there is this language is so interesting. Allah b'libo, it just arose in his heart. So the reason, he says, is being witness to the miracle, and the response. So, okay, that's joy, or it's awe, or it's wonder, or it's overwhelm, whatever it is, right? He's giving us the poem is a response to the miracle, to being witness to the miracle, and then it just comes up in his heart, right? So it's almost like it's involuntary. It's like it's like automatic. It's an instinct or something. So I'd like us to think that out a little bit. What does it mean that you see something and then it just comes up? It bubbles up in your throat, right? Okay, let's see here. Who's got a response to this? I want to welcome anyone. I will call on people twice, but I want to welcome anyone to raise their hand. And anyone that we're all just looking at this clean, so you don't have to be an expert to comment in this class. Len Sharzer.
Thank you. Something just occurred to me listening to Ariel and a couple of the other comments that I had never thought before. the African slaves in this country created a music. I mean, that's the source of the spirituals. And it was a way for the slaves to kind of communicate with each other, to do something together. And relating, these are newly freed Israelite slaves who are singing the song. And the way it says, Az Yashir in the singular Moshe, Moshe sang Uvnei Israel. So maybe this is his chance to join these slaves, these newly freed slaves, in their musical way of communicating with each other that may have taken them through their period of slavery.
That's really interesting. That's as it happens, I was just watching a documentary on Robert Johnson last night. Robert Johnson, sort of grandfather of the blues. And somebody said in that documentary, they say the blues comes from church, but that's a lie. The blues comes from the field, right? And some notion that there's a tradition that slaves have to chant to pass the time, to communicate to one another, to express the only creativity that they can, and that an entire art form can be developed, in these constrained conditions. So it is interesting to think with Len that maybe this isn't the beginning of biblical poetry, right? It is in the sense that it's the recorded beginning, but that actually, surely, if we're to take seriously the notion that the people have these mechanisms for calling and responding and chanting and being led in this form, that's a form which exists already, and that actually it isn't just freedom which produces poetry, but freedom that allows it to really be unleashed in this full way, but that it actually is a tradition nourished even by those who are oppressed. That's an important thought. Alexandra?
I don't know that this thought is really any good, but I guess I have the need to share it. But it's I'm stuck on the future tense, and I'm looking at Hannah. And I'm stuck on the future tense, and it's just baffling to me, and so I just had to go back there in order to move forward. But this idea of the faith, and that's what will get him to sing, and that's what will get the people to sing. I don't have the source sheet in front of me, but that's how I'm remembering it. And just the idea that faith is like, they just had this crazy miracle. Like, there's no way you can possibly rationalize this and as like not God, but their faith is still sort of developing. And the idea that like, it's not yet there totally, because they will be singing in the future once they have the faith. So just this idea that faith is like this constant developing thing, that it's not, just like one miracle isn't enough. Like, you can't, it's just growing.
I have a response to her. Hello, sure. There is no future tense in biblical Hebrew. It's either imperfect or perfect tense. There's no future tense in the Bible. So that's a common mistake made by grammarians today. But based upon Hebrew Semitics, there's no future tense in the Hebrew Bible. So that's something to think about.
Okay, that I don't think we should get too deep into the grammar here. That's not the way. Okay, that's not my understanding. But you're right, at least, that there is a kind of ambiguity around the use of the future tense in the Bible. And if it has, for example, a vav in front of it, it suddenly becomes the past tense, which is the way that it seems to be used here, and yet is it does not have that. So there are grammar issues here, and I think probably they would be beyond the scope of this discussion.
Okay,
but be that as it may, I think this whole conversation is correct in that it brings us to this sort of like indeterminacy of the kind of the temporal location of this poem. And Alexander was suggesting this, and the Midrashim suggest this as well, which is like, is Moses going to recite this poem in the future? Is he reciting it now? Is it like, will this poem be recited throughout history? Is there some way in which this moment will continue to echo throughout all of the moments of freedom? And the Midrashic tradition plays on this a lot. Okay, I want to take one more comment, and then before we run out of time, I want to bring you to some of these really magnificent reflections from the tradition on the role of poetry in this moment. Yonatan had his hand up though.
Yeah, so anyone who has experienced long-term abuse knows that you put up protective mechanisms, right? You learn to numb your feelings and to isolate yourself from human experience, because that's the way you survive. And I think what we see with this explosion of emotion is the moment that those protective mechanisms aren't necessary anymore, right? And these people get to be human. This is not an uncommon human experience. It's very real, right? And it's complicated. It's always messy. And I think this song is really messy in terms of like, you don't get to control the way that those protective mechanisms get dismantled in your mind, right? And like things just kind of come out of you. And I think that is what we're seeing here.
It's so beautifully put, Yonatan. That I just want to pause and really take that in. This idea that, one of the ways to look at this moment is that it really is a kind of a thawing of a heart that had to be frozen, or a release of a heart, right? Rashi uses the language of the heart. It just sort of, it comes up in the heart. And it is as if like the heart is finally free. Heart is finally free to express it, to beat, to be human. And this really is, in some ways, in its most basic expression, it's a moment of, we can finally sing, we can finally feel, we can finally be, right? That's a big moment, right? To be given the fullness of expression. And even if there were ways in which oppressed peoples are always fine to express themselves, this is a moment where it's like, like hear my voice. Okay, all right. Now, I want now to take us a little bit deeper into the idea that we've been sort of considering, that Rashi and Marlena introduced to us, that we must sing, that there's a kind of response, like something happens and it just comes out of us. And I think Yonatan is playing on that sort of almost like involuntary nature, automatic nature of poetry as a kind of response to a moment. And I want to do that by taking us into the writings of one of, I think, the greatest thinkers in Jewish history, the Maharal of Prague. Is sort of famous for making the Golem. You've probably heard of him for that, but that's not really what he did. What he really did was wrote this incredible corpus of Jewish thought. And one of his greatest works is a book called Gvurot Hashem, which is all about the Exodus. It's just a whole book on the Exodus, and it's like 70 chapters of just like discourse after discourse after discourse. And it's certainly one of the greatest books I've ever read. I recommend it highly. We're going to look just now at a piece here in which he is speaking about this very moment of Az Yashir, of then they erupted into song. And the Maharal is going to build on this idea that they almost had to, but is going to also connect it to this larger moment of liberation. Remember, Rashi just gave us the language of seeing a miracle and just responding to that. The Maharal is going to bring in some as Yonatan was just doing, some larger context. So take a look at this. This is really like, I think, for me, this is like core Jewish thought. The Maharal of Prague, 16th century, yes, late 16th, early 17th century thinker. Okay, this is his book Gvurat Hashem. Okay, so here he begins. It was when Israel came up out of the sea and crossed over that they reached the level of their true essence. Az kanu Yisrael etzem madregatan umalatan. They reached the level of their true essence, as we have explained earlier, there's a typo there, in this book. And they could not reach this level until they crossed the sea. That is why, and here's a little, speaking of poetry, here's a little word play for you. That is why the people of Israel are called Hebrews, Ivrim, because they crossed the sea, Avar Yam. Okay, if you know Hebrew, then you'll appreciate this word play. It's the same letters there in Hebrews, Ivrim, and crossed the sea, Avar Yam. Okay, let's just stop there, and I'm going to push us forward, but let's just stop for a moment and try and understand what is he saying here? When they crossed the sea, they reached their true essence. How is it? What does he mean by that? Does anyone want to can anyone speak that out for us? What does it mean, Michal?
I'm not sure this is what you're asking for, but what really struck me is how universal the metaphor of rebirth through water is, because he's saying, right, their true essence is a kind of rebirth, and it couldn't happen until they go through, the experience of water and mikvah and baptism. And I mean, it's almost universal, right? What is it? The Buddhist festival of Holi, they do the same thing, go into the water. I mean, it's just so wonderful to see that just keeps coming up over and over and over again. Good.
I love this language of birth, and I think it fits right in here that Michal is reading into this, that there's a kind of, there's a passageway, right, between a narrow canal, and then they are born anew. They are born in this moment. They become Israel in this moment. They become who they are the moment that they cross the Red Sea, and it is a kind of the landscape reminds us that this is the birth. Right, you can't use that phrase anymore because there was a racist movie, but the birth of a nation, right? This is it. So they become Israel. Anyone want to build on that? What does it mean that as they cross the sea, they reach their essence? Anybody else want to build on that? Payam?
I'll give you my input as an artist. Being an artist is wrestling with impossibility. It's creating things that have never existed before. It's dealing with it in all of its facets, and once you get past that impossibility, you create that thing that couldn't exist or you never saw before. That is when you get to your true essence. So that's in essence, I mean, that's what they're doing. They're being artists. When they were in that water, they saw the impossible, but then they moved past the impossible to something, and that is the creation of art. And that's when he says, they've reached their true essence, is that by that creation, the process of creation elevated them to their true essence.
Wow, okay. So it's not just, says Payam, that they are now free, and technically they are now their own people, but there's something about the moment of liberation that allows them to begin to, now we can express ourselves fully. And I think as Payam formulates it, part of what it means to reach your true essence is to find a way to express it, to find some form, some maybe artistic medium, you have to find your voice. It's not just that you are free now, but now who are you? And how do you express yourself in the world, right? I think that's also part of what's happening here. It's the freedom of them coming through the water, but then the voice echoes that. They come through the water and then the voice comes through their mouths. It's like a second crossing, a second exodus, right? That echoes the first, right? In that artistic and that poetic form. All right, let's keep going now. Okay, so that's where he starts, the Maharal. They reached their essence in this moment where they cross the sea. Now, let's see how he connects that to this poem, this recitation, this song. So he says, and now you're really going to take a deep dive into his theology here, but he says, and all beings that were created by the blessed God were created for God's glory. As it says in Isaiah, right? If you need proof, it says in Isaiah, anyone who was created in my name, I created, formed, and made for my glory. Kol hanikra b'shmi, l'chvodi, barativ, yatzartiv, afasitiv. Therefore, all creatures in the world say a song or a poem. Lefikach kol hanivraim ba'olam omrim shira. Every creature in the world has a poem, has a song to sing, because the song or poetry is the glory of the Blessed One. Ki hashira, right here it is, ki hashira kvodo yitbarach. The song, all creatures in the world have a song or a poem to say to the Holy Blessed One, because the song is the glory of the Blessed One. And everything that exists has a trace of God's glory in it. And that is why song or poetry comes from all things. I just want us to soak this in a little bit. This is the magnitude of what he just said here. Okay? Everything in the world, now you have to accept his premise, is created for God's glory. I'm not even sure what that means. I'm not even sure if I'm translating it correctly. The kavod of God, the honor, the glory, the exaltation, the presence of God. But everything has a poem, because that is the glory. It is both the way that you express this glory of God, but it actually is the glory of God itself. And we'll just finish this off. And it is because of this, it is because of this that when Israel finally reached their true essence, when they crossed the sea, then there's that word, immediately they said or sang a song or a poem. And here is where we get the national, the liberation context, because Israel had just become a nation or a people, right? They became a people. It was only right that this new entity should manifest the glory of the blessed God. And so they said a song or sang a song or said a poem. Okay? So all things have a poem that is an expression of their essence. That's how the Maharal says it. How would you say it? What do you think he's getting at here? How do you respond to this idea that everything in creation is poetizing, is singing, has a song to sing, and that song is their expression of the glory of God? That's a lot to take in, but I wonder what you all think. Anne, let me turn to you. You had a hand up before. And we can hear you.
Well, first of all, I'm thinking of the music of the spheres, from Shakespeare. I mean, this idea that the universe is driven by music is, something that has come up since this. And then I'm also thinking of how quite literally in nature, I mean, if you've ever woken up at dawn, you've heard, the insects start humming, and then the birds start going. And then, rodents start, I mean, there is a thing in nature where the whole world exalts with the rising of the sun. And so it's not just a human thing to sing, it happens, with all living things. And there are even scientists who believe that plants are singing, so there's that aspect of it. And then also I think of, one of the things I miss most about Ikar is, you know, when we are all together and, you know, we're reciting Shema and all our voices are all, you know, rising together. And there is a feeling of not only coming into oneself, but also this feeling of us all being one. And now I'm getting verklempt, so I'm going to mute myself.
You're getting verklempt because you're cutting right to the core of this so beautifully, Anne. I mean, that's right. I think that's right. That's where the Maharal is going. The whole world is singing. The whole world has a poem, but not just a poem. It's a symphony, but everyone has a part. Everyone has the notes that they're playing. Everyone has the particular poetic voice, and the birds have it, and we hear them, right? And the trees have it, and we experience the poetry of the trees, right? And the whole wide world is a great cosmic symphony, right? A great epic poem that we all participate in, right? Yeah. Okay. And then we have to start to ask, okay, so how is it that Israel in this moment got their part? Now they have the poem that they're singing, right? Just like the birds. And this is the moment where they became themselves. They became what they are. All right, let's keep going. We have a lot of wonderful hands up. Let's see if we can get to a lot of them. Kathy Kobayashi.
Yeah, actually, this was an earlier remark or thought, but it fits in here where I was really struck at the very beginning that then Moses and the Israelites sang the song. That so many times, you know, it's sort of Moses, God says something to Moses, Moses says something to the people, but here they sing together from immediately. It's not Moses leading, you know, it's not Moses singing and then people kind of following along or something like that. And I think it's because of what we've been talking about here, that somehow it's tapping into, some sort of essence that's shared. So you didn't need a leader to teach the people the song, or it wasn't that kind of song but that it spontaneously arises in that way. So I
want to remind us of the way what Kathy just said is in some ways the inverse of what Len Sharzer said earlier, right? Because Len was imagining the people have this poetic tradition and Moses is entering into the poetic tradition with the people. Kathy is saying almost the inverse, which is that Moses has been the voice of the people, but now the people join. And whichever way you slice it, both of these thoughts express the idea that I think the Maharal is getting at, which is that now they were a people. And the people, Moses probably had his poem, his song, and every one of the Israelites had their own poem, just as every created thing has its own expression, its own poetic voice. But now that they are a people, now that they are Israel, now they sing together. They have their national poem. They have their collective poem. They can, the way that we do, as Anne was saying, when we come together in shul and we sing together, we've got our poems. We've got our songs. We've got the poems that are the expression of who we are, not just as individuals, but now as a collective entity. Right?
Right. Can
Right.
I add one thing?
Yeah.
There is a way in which what Len was saying and what I'm saying could come together, and that there could have been this past experience of song that somehow laid a kind of a groundwork, but that this is the moment when it all really, really comes together. And what comes to mind is when Hillel was teaching us the Hallelujah, his Hallelujah for the first time, and he's starting to just sing, it was like 1,000 people in the room, and he's like divides us up and he's going, okay, this is the first part. This is the second part. He was teaching the parts, and he gets up to 3, 4 parts. I go, okay, fine. Then he goes up to 5, and then he gets 6. And anyway, it was pretty incredible. But like there can be a basis. It's not necessarily all out of nothing.
I love that description, Kathy, because it's like, imagine Moshe doing that, you know, and Moshe sort of leading the people, but the more musical voices in the people also doing some, Miriam's doing some leading, but there's something that happens where they join voices. And maybe it's not just that the poem is a response to the freedom or to the becoming who they are. The poem is the moment where they become who they are. It is when they have the freedom, but now through the poem, they unite as a people. As their voices unite, they unite and they become a new thing, a collective entity, a new being, a new creature in the world, and they manifest themselves. And their manifestation is the glory of God. Okay, let's see if we can get Hannah, Jen, and Emil before we close. Hannah Jensen.
Yeah, I'm stuck there too, where the place where Kathy took us back to, but I have just a question I can't quite get past that I don't know, which is kind of a boring one. But at the beginning, there's this repetition that I find very strange in the Torah, which is that it says, and then Moses and the Israelites sang this song to God. They sang, I will sing to God. Like there's this introduction of they're singing to God, and then they say, we're singing to God. Mm. And it's strange, really, because, yeah. Yes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they do it here, and then they do it. Yeah, right. Go ahead.
Because the Torah, as we know, doesn't have a lot of words in it, really. So usually things are there for a reason. And so I've been trying to think about what is that? Because it seems to me like it's a stutter or it's a break or it's some kind of like, it's not just a clean transition into this moment. There's some kind of hiccup or something is uncomfortable about it that Moshe or whoever has to first explain, okay, this is what's happening. And they're like, okay, and now it's happening. But it's not just, maybe there's some lingering grief. There's some lingering something that causes this moment of stopping before they get to the joy, before they get to this reckless abandon of singing. First, it has to be kind of an inward moment of this is what's going to happen. Okay, I'm preparing myself and now it happens. It doesn't seem to me like it's fully spontaneous. It seems like it took a second to get there. And that maybe even part of that was figuring out, what are we singing? That this moment was a moment for them to gather themselves or gather their thoughts to be able to understand what they were about to even have anything to say about, that they weren't quite sure. There's still a moment before that.
Yeah. I love the way you put that, Hannah. And it's right. There is a kind of, I will sing, now I am singing. And I think Rashi is addressing that. I think Rashi is wondering, why is it in the future? That's what Rashi's responding to. And Rashi's saying, well, first they had this something come in their heart. And then they realize, oh, I have to respond to that. I have to sing to that. There's a moment of like kind of summoning oneself as it rises up within. And then suddenly a kind of an eruption, a declaration. You said that much better than I did. Jen?
I guess my question is in the Maharal's thing where he says, therefore all creatures in the world say a song or poem. I was reading it as not literally a song or a poem, but more so as in giving each individual agency and each individual a voice.
Yes, I think that's right. I appreciate that. There's something very beautiful about the language.
In a positive way.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, like I was thinking of that in a positive way, that it was sorry.
No, I think you're right. I think that is the deeper meaning of everything singing a song. You know, everything's not really singing, is that everything is expressing itself. Mm-hmm. Everything is proclaiming its being into the world, right? And in order to do that, as so many of as the wise comments throughout this discussion have suggested, you need to be able to exist and to exist freely, and to exist freely and free enough to proclaim, to speak, to let your voice out. And so liberation is something that happens to a nation, but in a sense, it's like all beings, all creatures, all of existence wants to be free, wants to be free enough to say, this is who I am. Here I am. Here I am. This is us. We are here, right? And that's also like a form of liberation. Okay, last comment, Emil Stern.
Wow, thank you. The first thing I was thinking, this is very different from all of the like raging, angry old men poems we've been reading, the last few weeks. And it's like, and it did make me think, like looking into meditation and people that I admire over the pandemic, like people like Nick Cave, David Lynch, there's like ideas are there, and it's just up to us to be like happy enough or like open ourselves enough to collect them, and that sort of resonates with what you're saying, that it's like everything has a song. It's like if we can hear it, it's like but what you're saying made me think, the fact that they're in this state of joy and liberation and release allows them to look around and see each other. Whereas like all of those other poems we read, the Psalms, those, like as amazing as they are, they're all very solipsistic, like, God, why have you forsaken? It's all about me, right? It's like, why am I here alone, rattling my cages, my bars? And it's like all of these things seem to come together to me, like openness, liberation, community, like opening your eyes and seeing like a bigger world and a bigger picture, and a sort of communal song, as you say, as opposed to like a sad lament by yourself.
That I think Emil is understanding something important about this scene, but also about the Maharal's description of a kind of a world as Anne described it, kind of like a kind of a symphony, a kind of cosmic symphony, and that description has certain important implications. And one is that we should be listening to the songs all around us, to the poems that the world is singing, that everybody we should have our ears open to that, but also that we have to figure out what our song is. We have to figure out like, what is it that we're here to express? And as Emil says, what about we? What is this group's poem? What is this group's song? What is our community's song? What is our people's song? What is our nation's song? What is our world's song, right? But every little thing, and I want to end now. I brought a couple of pieces. We're not going to have time to look at. One of them is so intriguing, but probably would take a whole nother hour to unpack, and that is just building on this idea that everything in the world is singing. This is a I'm just going to reference it quickly. This is a piece from Rabbi Nachman, 19th century Hasidic master, who famously has this whole piece here that I'll invite you to study on your own. But he says each and every blade of grass has a poem which it recites, right? So that and this plays on a midrashic tradition, actually, that every blade of grass has an angel that watches over it. Maybe you've heard of that, but Rabbi Nachman's formulation is different. Every blade of grass has a poem that it recites, has a song that it sings. And on that note, I want to close this series with one final poem. This one outside of the Jewish canon, but also from someone who, first of all, had a great appreciation of the Hebrew Bible, but also someone who certainly saw the world in this way, a world that was alive and singing. And this is one of my favorite poems by Gerard Manley Hopkins, English poet of the 19th century. And usually I just teach the first stanza of this because the second stanza has a lot of Christ in it, but I need the second stanza, and I think we'll be fine, right? We're good, open-minded people, that we can end this Jewish biblical poetry series with a little Christ. And actually, the way he uses it, Christ is something different than I think we usually understand it. But let's take a look. This is Gerard Manley Hopkins, and I think it's just like Rebbe Nachman. Every blade of grass, everything in the world. So just listen to this poem, and we'll close with it. It's called "As Kingfishers Catch Fire." All right, listen to this. This is just one of the greatest poetic expressions I've ever heard. As kingfishers catch fire, dragonflies draw flame. As tumbled over rim in roundy wells, stones ring like each tucked string tells each hung bell's bow swung finds tongue to fling out broad its name. Each mortal thing does one thing and the same, deals out that being indoors each one dwells. Selves goes itself, myself it speaks and spells, crying, what I do is me, for that I came. And I usually end there, and that's powerful enough. But look at the next line. I say more. The just man justices. The just man justices. Keeps grace. That keeps all his goings graces. Acts in God's eye what in God's eye he is. Christ, for Christ plays in 10,000 places. Lovely in limbs and lovely in eyes, not his, to the Father through the features of men's faces. I needed, I mean, there's a lot there, but I'll leave it to the Christians to unpack. But this thing here, this line here, right? Everything in the world is calling out me, myself. And that's why we're here. We're here to manifest the glory of God that is within us, to sing our song, to recite our poem, right? And he adds, when we act, all of creation is doing this, every blade of grass, every kingfisher, every dragonfly, but we each have our own song. And when we act in the world with justice, that's a poem. That's a manifestation of the glory of God, right? Every act of kindness, every act of justice, every act of goodness in the world is a new poem, a new song, a new manifestation of Kvodo Shel Hashem Yitbarach, of the glory of God. Whoo! Wow, what a journey it has been. I'm so honored to be able to do this with you all, to be able to learn together in this group. It is just, this is just such a privilege to have the gathering of minds and hearts and eyes and ears. It's really been my honor. I do want to just end by, and Emma, if you will put this in the chat, I just want to end by, listen, it's been great, but I'd also would love to hear some of your feedback. It's a very quick feedback form. I've designed it so I really think it should take no more than 2 minutes. But if you have an opportunity there in the chat, if you could just fill out what you liked about this, what you didn't like about it, if you have any suggestions, could be my teaching, could be the way technology works, could be just some brilliant idea that you have that I haven't thought of. I would love to hear your feedback. It's been such a privilege. Thank you all for your Torah, for your poetry, for your voice. Happy Passover. Wish you a season of liberation. May we learn to sing the song of ourselves, the song of our own freedom. Bye, everybody.